Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
And today we are covering The Joker. It's the second part of our two-part series where we talked about parasocial relationships and media in the 1983 film The King of Comedy. Now we're talking about the 2018 film The Joker, directed by Todd Phillips. But before we get into it, as always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. We really need to know where we're screwing up or what we're really killing or what amazing idea you have. We've run out of ideas for the show. So we really are like, come on, feed us, feed us. So Randall, what's a good way for people to just
Well,
get
you can
to
go
us?
you can go to our website, chrisandrandall.com. Also, check out Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall on Facebook. Good way to connect with us.
All right. Well, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. We're feeling very low. All right, Randall, take us through.
Well, we're going to talk about Joker, the movie Joker today. I mean, I'm sure you've never heard of it. No, it was a huge hit. This is like a monster hit movie. Todd Phillips, who's, a total visionary director, he made one of his first movies. I think his first movie was the Gigi Allen documentary. He,
Who's
he had
Gigi Allen, by the way?
Gigi Allen was, I want to say he was a punk rocker, but he was like
All right.
he was a performance artist, musician. I mean, Gigi Allen would say he was a rock and roller, but he would engage in crazy antics on stage, like throwing his feces at the audience. I mean, after crapping into his hand. I mean that's just the tip of the iceberg, Chris. That's just the start of what he would do. But Todd Phillips was visionary enough to go ahead and start making a documentary about Gigi Allen when nobody else probably had heard of him. I mean, Gigi Allen never became that famous. But yeah, the Gigi Allen documentary that Todd Phillips made is amazing. Yeah, and Todd Phillips, went on to make big comedies. I think he made The Hangover, right?
Yep.
And so Phillips, there's a great interview Phillips did with Michael Moore. I'll link to that, where Phillips talks about making this movie. Phillips, was a big fan of the 70s movies, like King of Comedy that we talked about, Taxi Driver. Tarantino is called Taxi Driver the greatest movie ever made. He might not be wrong. But Phillips was thinking, why can't I make a great 70s movie today? Why won't the studios let me? I mean, how can I convince the studios to let me make a 70s movie? And his idea was he would merge a 70s movie with a comic book movie. So that's how he thought of Joker. And
I do want to correct you on one thing, though, which is kind of really important. The Joker takes place in 1981, which is the same year that last episode's King of Comedy took place, and it's done deliberately because it's set in New York City. I mean, the Gotham of 1981 is based on a New York City of 1981, which Todd Phillips is like 2 years younger than me. So Todd Phillips he was 13 years old living in New York City in 1981. So it is very much also not just a cinematic world, but it is an actual world that he is trying to recreate.
well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
he's
I mean, and in fairness, that's a big point because if he read Batman in that period in history, and I'm sure he did, a lot of the artists who drew Gotham City, like Neil Adams, were living in the Bronx, in Manhattan, and they were using New York City as visual cue points for Gotham City.
Yeah, well, 70s New York was filled with crime and
Tell me
deprivation,
more.
and well, you know more than me, Chris. I mean, you grew up
That's
there.
my point. But that's what I'm trying to explain is that, Phillips, it's not, he's not Tarantino. He's not falling in love with a Hollywood New York City. He is really trying to, as you said, a documentarian. He starts out as a documentarian. And like any documentarian, he has a real great sense of place and time. And he is, I would argue, fascinated by the way filmmakers like Martin Scorsese would capture the New York City of his youth. And in that sense, he's not really looking at the Hollywoodization of New York City as much as trying to bring back do his attempt at capturing that New York City of that particular era by filming those parts of New York City and New Jersey that still look like that era, which when watching the movie, it blew my mind just how much. There's that famous scene where the Joker is dancing down the steps. Do you remember that?
Yes.
It's in the poster. All right. Well, there's some buildings on both sides of the steps. One of the buildings on the left side of the step is the apartment my mom grew up in.
Well, the New York of the 70s New York we think of, it's characterized not by the architecture of the 70s, but the architecture that pre-existed. It's the 70s New York was filled with crumbling buildings that were hundreds of years old, or 100 years old, I should say.
Right, and I'm just trying to say that it's more of a 1981 story than a 1976 story, and that there is a very key distinction between New York of 1981 versus New York of 1975. And the key distinctions of New York of 1981 is that you're seeing a much greater dichotomy between rich and poor, which is clearly going to turn out to be very essential in the telling of the tale of the Joker.
Yeah, some people look at the 70s as like the great...
And early 80s. Go on.
Well, going with your point, Chris, I mean, some people look at the 70s as like the great populist era of America, where dance fever and discos and equality and, some degree of, the economic prosperity starts to end in the 70s. But then the 80s is like the start of the Reagan years, is the start of disconnect between rich and poor, a real deepening of, or a real the classes start to diverge more. I mean, it really starts in the 70s.
Well, the 60s is the height of the economy, the end of the American century. New York City goes into default in the 70s, but when New York starts gentrifying in the early 80s, and also drugs and violence becomes much greater in the early 80s, crack cocaine, these are the things that start to really make up the city. Ed Koch is the mayor, and he's certainly better than Abe Beame, but in trying to gentrify and make the city better, working middle class people who live on the fringes of the city, who were able to get by during the 70s, are starting to get pushed out. And that's something tangentially dealt with in The King of Comedy, but very present in the Joker. There really is in the Joker a real sense of class stratification.
Well, yeah, that is an interesting aspect of the Joker movie. We should do a whole show on this sometime, but I feel that with Hollywood movies, there's very little attention paid to any kind of class stratification, any kind of class analysis. I feel like there's only like a handful of movies that really do it. And Phillips was able somehow, I don't know how, Chris, but he was he was able to shove that into this movie, a class analysis into this movie.
And I give it up to Phillips because, like Scorsese, who was for a little while the executive producer of this movie, it's a real New Yorker's take. That's the best thing I can say.
Well, why do you say that?
Well, if you live in New York City, and then this has always been true of New York City, rich or poor, good times or bad times, middle-class people, professional people, even rich people can't escape poor people. Whether it's you take the subway or you take a cab, you're still going to share the streets. You're still going to share the movie theater. You're still going to share enough common spaces that you're always kind of rubbing shoulders with these groups. So you're always aware of who's doing better than you and who's doing worse than you, how much better you can do and how much far you can fall. Whereas like in Los Angeles here, nah. Los Angeles is like most of America, very suburban. If you live in the right community, you'll never see a poor person. And if you live in the wrong community, you'll never see a middle-class person. I live in Westwood Village, so my neighbors live in Bel Air and Beverly Hills, so I'm in the slum. You live in West Hollywood. I don't even know what to make of where you live, but you get my point.
Well, in a sense, I mean, in New York, the class divisions aren't hidden, right?
No, they're right out in front of your face. The richest neighborhood still abuts one of the poorest, and vice versa. It's just the way the city is structured. the tight
Right.
little island.
Right. And in the rest of America, the divisions, the rest of America, the classes have done a really good job of geographically dividing themselves, haven't they? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
there are whole communities in America now where, I mean, I think in Florida there's an island of just like mansions. I forget what it's called. There's a bunch of celebrities that own houses out there, and poor people will go out there, but they're going to be maids and janitors and things like that.
So
So
every
yeah,
time you tell a New York story, if you want to tell it honestly, you deal with it. Like there's a famous thing that happened in 1984 in New York where a guy named Bernie Getz, who was a software engineer, middle class guy, lived in the village in his late 30s, very not a very muscular man, kind of, I hate to say it, but kind of geeky. And he was on the subway, and these four black kids, black boys, they try to mug him, worth at five. And he says, "Sure, I got $5 for each of you." And he literally takes out a gun and he shoots them all. This is his big, like, it was a movie back in the 70s called Death Wish where Charles Bronson walked around the city trying to get mugged so he could shoot people. So anyway, this vigilanteism caused a big outcry and divided up the city between those people who felt Getz was right to shoot the muggers, and Al Sharpton led a contingent of people who thought, no, that was just straight up racist. And he just shot five black boys because he was prejudiced. Now, I don't want to get into the fullness of this. You Google it, but you'll see that the guys who he shot really were going to mug him and really did have criminal histories. But I was in college in the Midwest at the time, and oh my God,
what?
questions I were asked, like, how could someone carry a gun in the subway? That's terrible. And don't you think it's just terrible that he would shoot muggers? And I'm like, no, that made sense to me. No, I'm not saying I'm doing it. I never have.
You've been
But
mugged before, right, Chris? I mean,
I have, and I never shot anyone for it. You know.
But can you tell me about the experience?
I was 8 years old, and a kid mugged me. The end. I haven't been mugged as an adult, but I was mugged by a 10-year-old when I was 8. Sad little story. He got $4 from me in my wallet, and a comic book too, I think. But my point is that Phillips himself is slightly more of a conservative person than I am. He's like, I stopped making movie comedies because society's too woke. I get you, buddy. But my point
said
is,
that?
oh yeah, he's a cultural conservative. But which is interesting because Scorsese's, I don't think is. But it's very clear that what Phillips is trying to show is that there is a real boiling point to urban living, and even if you're not crazy to begin with, there is something about living in a city, a Gotham city, that can drive someone mad to vigilantism. And after all, what is Batman but simply a vigilante who protects others versus the Joker?
Well, it is interesting in this movie. In the script, and Phoenix, his character, the Joker, he talks about the system a few times in the movie. I think Phillips, he's able to put these little things in there talking about class analysis every now and then, but he's not able to totally expand on it in this movie. But it is interesting that the Joker at some point seems to be fighting against the system, and he's organizing a revolution against the system. Which is
interesting because we're comparing it to King of Comedy, and it's actually quite literally the opposite, right? Like, they both reach messianic status, but I would argue that Rupert Pupkin is embraced by this system, whereas is it Arthur Fleck? I cannot remember the name.
Well,
the Joker is trying to tear down the system.
Right. Well, Pupkin loves the system, and in both these movies, there is a point where the parasocial relationship sours. Right. They realize that they have a fake relationship. The fantasy of the relationship can no longer be maintained by the fantasist because the reality is been shoved in their face. So for Pupkin, it's when he visits the house. He visits Langford's house with his girlfriend, and he gets kicked out. For Joker, it's when Murray, is it Murray? He puts
played by Robert De Niro.
Right. I mean, in a lot of ways, Joker is like almost like an unofficial sequel of King of
Right,
Comedy. I
because
think.
Murray Franklin is maybe just Rupert Pupkin. Though I do have to admit, I think Murray Franklin is a tribute to the New York City talk show host Joe Franklin, who I once met, who was a real character, who probably had interviewed Robert De Niro, and maybe even Robert De Niro's dad. But yes, I think you are correct that I like the idea that this is Rupert Pupkin.
Right. So when the parasocial relationship sours for Joker is when he makes fun of his comedy routine on his show, and by the time Murray's staff gets to calling the Joker to be on the show, and be a star in the show, it's like he's already done with Murray. I mean, it's like he's not even happy about it.
And we're gonna hit some heavy duty spoilers, and I really want to hit this one right off the bat. So stop listening if you haven't seen the movie. So at the end, when the Joker shoots Murray Franklin on live TV, which you could argue is almost like an echo all the way back to Howard Beale in Network, who is shot on live TV.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, when Jerry Lewis was making suggestions on King of Comedy, that's what he suggested should be the ending of the movie. That Rupert should just shoot Jerry Langford on live TV.
When I first read that on IMDb's trivia, I thought that didn't sound good, like a good ending at all. But now that I think about it, if he would have shot him and then at the end there was a more realistic depiction of Pupkin becoming a big star, and he actually just became a big star from that, after serving in prison or whatever, that might have been a more interesting ending, honestly.
I mean, look, I'm not one to normally say that Jerry Lewis is right, but Jerry Lewis also did The Nutty Professor. So, in fairness, France is right. Jerry Lewis is a comedic genius, and if Jerry Lewis comes up with an ending to make your comedy better, by all means, don't be stupid.
I think
it would have been a much better ending. As much as I love King of Comedy, yes, and that's what made it so surprising when I watched The Joker, and they took it to the next level. Like, damn.
But you know what? Joker made a lot of money. People liked it a lot better, I think it worked.
It did work. I will say, critics loved King of Comedy, and it's still a very highly regarded film. But in 1981, what we were looking for in cinema was lighthearted comedy that was a comedy, or drama that was a drama. This hybrid dark satire shit just did not make it back then, especially if you were going to see Jerry Lewis. Whereas I think the audience people in 2018 were so jaded with superhero movies that they really were looking for something more revisionistic. And I mean, it's not to knock the film. I think the film's brilliant, but I do think that a 2018 audience is far more receptive to this kind of storytelling than a 1981 movie audience was.
Well, one thing I'll say,
even like superhero movies back then, to be honest.
Well, one thing I'll say about comic book movies in general is I think the urge, the impulse that the studios have, that fans have to want to see it. They want to see. They're trying to make movies that are like real, quote unquote. They're trying to take a comic book concept and turn it, quote unquote, real. And so a lot of these attempts have been tried. I mean, Batman Begins was like an attempt at that. I thought it was good, but it's still kind of comic booky. Nolan's Batman movies.
Where do you rank The Joker? Just curious, as a superhero movie.
I think The Joker is the best attempt ever at making like a comic book movie real, making it seem like it's in our world, right? And I was reading, I mean, would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, I would.
Okay.
I actually would.
I mean, and I was
you just
reading...
saved 5 minutes of me arguing with you. Yeah.
Okay, so because I think one thing the Joker movie does well is it gets the psychology right. Okay, which is something I think that a lot of these
very well. Like professional psychologists have said, they give him a real pathology with real episodes with real things. It's so much less. He's not insane. Like, and I said this in the last episode, but Rupert Pupkin's fantasist is really a social disease, not VD. But you know what I'm saying? It's a metaphoric disease of the sickness of our society. which is kind of where Howard Beale is at too. But no, in this movie, we're really dealing with clinical issues. And
Yeah,
I
well,
love that
yeah,
he's willing to really treat it as a real issue and not just this is a poet's idea of madness.
right. Yeah, Phoenix has said about his performance he was trying to actually nail down real psychological disorders in his performance.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I don't know. I think
Which
Pupkin
makes
really
actually his lack of, remember, because originally he has a therapist and medication, and due to budget cuts, he no longer gets therapy and medication. So the reality is, had there not been budget cuts, he might not have had a breakdown, which truly shows that the social stratification of a stage capitalist society is very much responsible for the actions of crazy people on the street, but not in like a high school student's, oh, capitalism's so bad it makes us all poor, but more like the true indifference of those who of the haves versus the have-not.
well, this is why I'm surprised that Phillips isn't like fully woke because because
I know it's weird. I think he's an economic populist and a social conservative.
well, I don't know. His
The only
politics
way I can square him.
His politics are probably fairly interesting, but yeah, I think a lot of like artists bristle against the whole woke some of the woke ideology because it seems to be anti-free thought and free speech. But what was I going to say? Yeah, so the Joker movie seems to it tries to advance an idea, tries to create an argument that the system, quote unquote, can make someone a criminal. Okay, yes. Because if you're a conservative, if you're like a strict conservative,
it goes right back to King of Comedy and Network, that all of these people are a victim of a machine of media and capitalism.
Right. So
and it preys upon the mentally unhealthy and the isolated and the alone. And gives them very few outcomes in life beyond the most violent ones.
Right. So if you're
whether to themselves or to others.
Right. So if you're a conservative, you would argue no. Each individual is responsible for their own actions, and no matter what has been done to them, they have the choice to rise above it. Okay. So with the Joker movie, Phillips is creating a scenario. I think trying to create a scenario where the Joker has no choice but to be the Joker. I mean, there are even scenes in the movie because of his mental disability. There are even scenes in the movie where he's trying to interact with quote unquote normal people, right? And all those interactions are tainted and destroyed by his mental illness, his laughter especially. So he has no choice, and I think I was reading somewhere that people with severe mental illness, like what the Joker character might have, they end up being isolated. They end up not being able to have relationships with, normal relationships with normal people, because of their mental illness. And they only have relationships with family.
It's a very grounded problem, unlike what we've discussed in the two prior films. Which is more like, hey, society sucks and it's making us crazy. Okay, whatever, buddy. Not to literally attack, to reduce what we argued in the last two episodes, but in the Network episode in King of Comedy. But you're right, it's a very real problem. And when watching this movie, it really does force you to think about what our real society is like. Even if this is a fantasy or very dark fantasy, the actual plight of a person like the character that Joaquin Phoenix is playing is very, unfortunately, very realistic. And maybe, again, that might be the documentarian, you think, in Phillips?
Well,
and his fascination with people like Gigi, whatever, who live on the fringes of society?
Well, we know that the genesis from Phillips' own mouth is that he's trying to make like a gritty 70s type movie, but yeah, also the impulse to make a comic book movie real, right? So yeah, that's part of it.
His point of comic book reference is Alan Moore's Killing Joke and Frank Miller's Batman: The
Well,
Dark
Moore,
Knight
yeah,
Returns.
well, Moore's trying
And
to do the
those are
same.
two, again, urban writers who are trying to deconstruct the myth of heroism and also juxtapose heroism with contemporary society. And it's very grounded and dark.
Well, are you?
So the source material is really, hey, Alan Moore is also the source material for Watchmen, and Frank Miller is pretty much the source material for all the good Christopher Nolan Batman films. So
Right. Well,
the well
Moore.
that Phillips has chosen to go to is one of the best wells for comic books.
Well, Moore and who's the
Miller.
300 guy?
I know
You
you're
just
talking about.
you just said him, but anyway,
Frank Miller.
Miller. Yeah. So both those guys, I think they're both of them are trying to make their comic book stories, real in a sense,
Yeah.
more realistic. I mean, it's hard to,
And they're
it's
both
hard.
hypercritical of media. They're both hypercritical of iconic heroism. They're both social critics who are using the medium of comic books to make stronger statements, much in the same way that Phillips is using the superhero movie or the supervillain movie to make a bigger statement about society. I mean, that's why they're good films, because they transcend their subject.
Well, let's get down to something, because if these are real, what's the fantasy? I mean, the fantasy is just like a
Jared
comic
Leto
book.
is the Joker in Suicide Squad, or what's his face, who won the Academy Award in the Dark Knight Returns.
Oh, Nolan's
Heath
Batman.
Ledger. Yeah, I mean, in fairness, all of those other things are, and in that sense, I think this is one thing it shares with King of Comedy, which is King of Comedy. You go in expecting a comedy, maybe a dark comedy. You're not expecting social commentary, and you go into Joker, you're expecting a better version of Suicide Squad. You're not expecting social commentary. So I love how both Phillips and Scorsese use popular entertainment mediums to address things that would traditionally be done by documentarians. Both of these men are documentarians, so they certainly would have known how to have done documentaries about people who live on the fringes or people who are fantasists or about urban decay, that they're willing to bring in that sensibility to such commercial ventures is, I think, subversive, and probably one of the reasons why we're talking about both of these films, that while they're 37 years apart in history, seem to just bookend each other seamlessly.
Well, I've always had this theory. I'll run it by you, Chris. I don't know if we've talked about it on this show before, but entertainment is what an audience wants to see, and art is what the artist is simply what the artist wants to express, like a purest form of the artist's expression. And of course, they can overlap. And I think that King of Comedy is it's probably too much art, but Joker is like a perfect mix of art and entertainment. I mean, what do you think?
Actually, I will say I prefer King of Comedy to the Joker. They're both great films, but I think they both achieve the same end regardless, which is they both force us to. I mean, in the way, aren't we all guilty of some degree of parasocial relationship? Don't we all aspire, like right now, you and I are broadcasting here, watching us on YouTube, to 50 to 100 million people right now are looking at my face and your face, or listening to us on the most listened to podcast on iTunes. Sorry, Mark Maron, I didn't mean to displace you, Joe Rogan, but we get like 1 billion fan letters every year. And I remember before we did Chris and Randall, I think I was once a regular mortal who did normal things. Now, my point is this, which is the one thing that all of these movies could not have foreseen is not people being famous for the sake of being famous. I would argue they definitely did, but that access to the media would always then make everybody famous. Whereas you and I are proof that you can now have access to media, be a part of media, and I'll be honest with you, just be a relatively average man who, once I get off this iPhone that I'm recording on, you guys won't know me from Adam.
Well, you're bringing up a good point, because both these movies, they explore parasocial relationships before the days of social media and the internet.
The democratization of social media, I guess, right?
Right. So So the thing is we're in an era now where almost anybody can start to develop a parasocial relationship with everyone. And
Yeah,
so like, we have friends that have watched this show, and so they know us from this show. They watch the show, and then they talk to us in real life. And so we're both having a parasocial relationship and a real relationship with them. But everybody's doing
exactly.
that. If you post on Facebook, you're having a parasocial relationship with somebody that you know, and then if you see them in real life, now you're having a real relationship. So it's
So it is very funny in the era of influencers that we could even think that, oh man, all you got to do is shoot a talk show host or at least kidnap them to be famous. Where, like, I would honestly say, if you're 17 years old right now, boy or girl, and you look pretty hot without a shirt on, and you have access to a sports car, congratulations, you're famous.
yeah. I mean,
Don't ask how I know this.
yeah, it's yeah, and there's all these stories that come out now. It's like people become internet famous, and there's positive and negative aspects to that. I mean, there's this category of the law that had to be invented, this law against revenge porn, because it was getting out of hand. And pornography in a sense is a parasocial relationship. And and I don't know, Chris. What am I trying to say? It's like we're in this new era where everyone is having these fake relationships with each other, and it's
Right.
just
So a lot of what both King of Comedy and the Joker are talking about, well, I would agree that you can have a great career being infamous. I would agree. I don't really think if you were a murderer, you would get your own talk show. But certainly Martha, what's her name? Martha Stewart went to jail, came back, and was still a celebrity. So some people can make a second act, a comeback from jail. Certainly people like Johnny Cash spent time in jail. And, I mean, so yes, hip hop rappers have gone to jail. So Wesley Snipes, so again, all he did was not pay his taxes. So what is my point? My point is that in some senses, these are really what I would call 20th century stories. One, because it was made in the 20th century. The other one is an homage to the 20th century. That doesn't mean that what's being said isn't relevant and pertinent today. It's just unlikely that someone is going to you cannot make this tale of somebody who wants to be famous, so they want to be on Jimmy Fallon
well. Tell me
today.
something, Chris, because
Even though technically we've got a ton of friends who are comics right now who would say, oh no, man, I'm going to do my tight five on Fallon or Conan or whatever.
Well, tell me something, Chris. I rewatched King of Comedy yesterday. Did you rewatch it like yesterday
Yeah.
or recently? Okay, so when I was watching it, I was thinking, man, you could remake this movie, but make the talk show host Jerry Langford. You can make him into like a social media influencer, like somebody with a lot of followers, and they have an obsessed fan, and you could totally update it and remake it. I mean, were you thinking that?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, like, though, today someone like Jerry Langford, realistically, would just have his own YouTube channel with over, millions of, I'm sorry, not Jerry Langford. Someone like Rupert Pupkin would just have a YouTube channel, and he might get lucky and have millions and millions of viewers and never need anything beyond that. And someone like the Joker, he might just have his own podcast where he just talks, and you never really have to be in front of people anymore. That's the weirdest thing about people who are podcasters and influencers and blogcasters is technically you no longer have to be in front of an audience. You just have to get subscribers and followers. So I know there was a movie with Andrew Garfield that came out earlier this year about that phenomena. We should watch it, and maybe we'll do another
What's it called?
episode on that. I don't remember.
All right,
But
I'll have to
we'll
look
watch
it up.
it, and that will be the next film that we'll discuss and see how it relates to what we've been this conversation that we've been having through network, parasocial relationships, King of Comedy, and now Joker. Anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I'm just thinking now. Maybe it's possible we're in the social media era that these parasocial relationships can actually work because
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I definitely feel we've left the era where talk show hosts like a Jerry Langford or a Murray Franklin were the true kingmakers.
Because
Now
well, you can imagine like somebody in that era, okay, a big TV show star, a fan sees them on the street, and for them it's like it could be like a once in a lifetime moment, so they'll
yeah,
freak out, right? Whereas today it's like you see a big time social media person on the street, you might say hi, but you know what? You could also just like tweet to them or email
yeah,
them, or I mean, it's like you can have
boundaries are much
an
more porous.
yeah, you can have an interaction with them. Everybody can have an interaction with them, and it's they're not so inaccessible, I should say. I mean,
What has remained
or
are
at least it feels that way.
right, but what has remained are the Rupert Pupkins and the Arthur Flecks, the quote unquote kings and jokers. I guess that should be the title of these two episodes. All right, the kings and jokers, these wild cards, people still exist and they're still out in the world on some level or another. They're still fantasists. They're still having parasocial relationships, and they're still out there trying to make it happen. And for most of these people, if you ever take a bus, I used to take the bus right by the Comedy Store, and all these people would come out of the bus, but just under like open mic, and there's a certain that soul crushing feeling of wanting what you cannot have and never getting it. Oh no, that's around now, and it'll probably be around as long as there's a system where people get to choose who's famous and who's not. So on that incredibly bleak note, please watch our show and make us famous. I'm tired of being Rupert Pupkin to your Arthur Fleck. I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
King of Comedy and the Joker. We'll talk about something really happy next week. Bye.
Bye.